Grace and peace. Welcome to Judah's Roar Domestic Violence Awareness Initiative YouTube channel. I am your host, Apostle Cheryl. Now, listen, before we get started, I'm going to give you a few seconds to check down here below the video, right down here, and make sure you subscribe if you've not done so already, and then click the bell for notifications. And that way, you'll receive a notice every time we upload a new video on Sunday evenings at 4 p.m. Central Standard Time. Also, you can read in the description box other ways that you can partner with us in our quest to end domestic violence. Thanks for taking a few minutes to address those things. Now, let's get started. This week, we're going to be talking about this question. I'm posing a question to you. Are you a resource or a roadblock? Are you a resource or are you a roadblock? Okay, now let's look at some definitions. It's important that we're all on the same page. A resource, by definition, is a source of supply, support, or aid, especially one that can be readily drawn upon when needed. Capability in dealing with a situation or in meeting difficulties. I'm going to read that again. A resource is a source of supply, support, or aid, especially one that can be readily drawn upon when needed. Having the capability in dealing with a situation or in meeting difficulties. Now, a roadblock is an action, condition, etc., that obstructs progress toward an objective. A roadblock is an action, condition, etc., that obstructs progress toward an objective. And so the question that I'm posing to you today is, are you a resource when it comes to domestic violence, or are you a roadblock? We can only be one or the other. Okay, so I'm going to challenge you to engage in some introspection, and that means looking inward and making an honest assessment about where you find yourself at the end of this video. Okay, now, generally speaking, if you are a reasonably decent human, you don't relish the thought of anyone being hurt um, or traumatized in any way for any reason. If you're a decent human, okay? Becoming aware that someone is experiencing abuse is incredibly challenging for us because it causes us to revisit our own core values and what we think is important and what we think is right and what we think is wrong. And it can physically trigger in us coping skills, and all kinds of emotions can pop to the surface when we hear about someone being treated um, in a horrible, abusive fashion. Okay. And so we have defense mechanisms that may pop up when we have these very strong emotions pop to the surface. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. I believe that the 5 stages of grief that have been associated with loss, etc., um, can really be applied also to the process that we may go through when we hear that someone's being abused or mistreated, especially if the perpetrator or abuser is someone that we love or felt that we enjoyed a positive relationship with or had great massive amounts of credibility with us or we admired and looked up to them. If we hear that they've been mistreating someone, it's kind of a shock. And like I said, it can bring up all kinds of feelings and then the accompanying defense mechanisms that we utilize when we just really, 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 really don't want to believe what we just heard. Okay, so let's look at those stages of grief. Shock. Now, when we're talking about domestic violence and learning that someone has been abusive to another individual, shock might look like, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. I cannot wrap my head around that they would do such a thing. Okay. Denial may look like, that's totally out of character. I don't believe that. That's totally out of character. Are you sure? Are you sure? And then anger. at the person who's alleging abuse. And that might look like this. Why are you saying those things about him or her? They're such an amazing person. They do so much good in the community. Um, they have this status, in society, and it would be beneath them to conduct themselves that way. They are a minister of the gospel. They are a priest. They are, you name it, okay? They're a professional. They're well thought of and sought after by others. They're an expert in their field. They wouldn't behave that way. Why are you accusing them of this? Okay. Bargaining. All right. So you're saying they did X, Y, and Z. What have you done to make things better? Maybe you should pray more. Maybe you should go to counseling, which, by the way, couples counseling in an abusive relationship is a horrible, horrible idea. And no seasoned, skilled mental health professional would recommend that. Okay. Acceptance. I am really sorry to hear this. How can I help you? What can I do to help? How can I lend you support? Okay. So we've talked about shock, denial, anger, bargaining, acceptance. And those are the stages of grief that we've become associated with when it comes to experiencing loss. But when we hear that someone that we hold in high esteem has engaged in abusive behavior, we do experience a loss. And that's why I think these stages really can apply under those circumstances. Now, our own personal experience with domestic violence or lack of experience with domestic violence impacts our perspective, right? And it impacts what we find believable when someone tells us that they've been mistreated. If you've been a victim of abuse of any form, you understand how possible it is, right? That this has occurred, no matter how graphic and awful it may sound. You also understand how it can very well appear that nothing is abnormal outside of that home environment or outside of that setting because you've experienced it. So you know that it's possible. If, on the other hand, you've not experienced it, it may be really, really hard to grasp that someone could present one way in public and a completely different way in private. Um, Now, hearing that someone that we've held in high esteem, whether it is a pastor or bishop or apostle or attorney or police officer or community activist or no matter the profession, they could just be a regular run-of-the-mill person that we have experienced as positive and encouraging. Maybe they coached a little league, or maybe they're in Girl Scouts and they're a troop leader, or maybe they're a pillar in the community and they are on the front edge of leading the fight against injustice in the criminal justice system, or whatever. If we've held them in high esteem and we are told that they have been abusive, it creates a problem for us individually and very personally, in our lives. And there's a whole slew of emotions that can erupt within us because of it. And one of the things that it can do is it can cause you to question your own judgment of character in others. It can cause you to question, how gullible am I, right? That I could be fooled by someone who is clearly living this double life and they're presenting one way in public and another way behind closed doors, if I'm to believe what I just heard. It can impact our ability to feel that we are capable of keeping ourselves safe and cause us to question our own ability to discern character in the people that we've allowed ourselves to become close to and to establish relationships with, okay? We may even be angry and feel that we've been duped by the abuser, that we've been fooled, we've been bamboozled, we've been manipulated. Okay. And if our knee jerk reaction to these feelings of confusion and betrayal, of being duped, of being fooled, being played, being manipulated, if those feelings are intense enough, it really could cause us to want to deny the veracity and the validity of what we've just been told about them being abusive. Why would we respond that way? Well, if we can deny and resist the fact that these things happened, we don't then have to take any responsibility for addressing something that is clearly wrong. We can excuse ourselves for not recognizing that this person was living a double life, that they were not who they said that they were, that they are capable of things that we find completely deplorable. And that leads us full circle to not having to do anything about it. We don't have to get involved. We don't have to feel uncomfortable because we will just deny that any of this is true, and dig in right there and let that be our position. The problem with this is that it makes us a roadblock, um, and it strengthens the hand of the abuser in the life of the victim. Because one of the things that victims are told often is that no one will ever believe that I did that to you. They'll never believe it. They'll never believe it. They'll think you're crazy. They're not going to support you. You'll lose your job. You'll lose your friends. And so when we don't overcome our own inner turmoil and our own resistance to wanting to believe the truth about someone being subjected to abuse, whether it's what we view one time, or it's been a long period of time, or it's in their past and it's affecting them now, or whatever. What has happened by default is that that person is no longer important. And what becomes the most important thing is that we not be uncomfortable about learning that someone that we have loved and trusted and admired and invested in emotionally, invested our confidence in, maybe even invested our finances in, has betrayed everyone, has betrayed everyone's confidence. Okay. And so it's important, if we're going to be a resource, that the victim remains the most important person, and that their safety is key, and that their safety is paramount. It's not unusual for it to take weeks, months, years, and years sometimes for a victim to even acknowledge and verbalize that they are experiencing abuse. And so when they finally do garner the wherewithal to share and to overcome their own humiliation and to overcome their own embarrassment long enough to speak it out loud and to say it out loud, that means that they've had to wrestle with this, wrestle with how they got there, wrestle with why they stayed, wrestle with why they haven't left, wrestle with why they left and repeatedly returned. And they overcome all of that, and they find the courage to share, and they choose you to trust with this information. They choose you out of all the people in the world that they could trust. They choose you to trust with this humiliating, embarrassing revelation. And if your response is, that didn't happen, are you sure? It really does crush them. It's crushing. It's crushing. It may be years before they are able to gather the wherewithal once again to trust anybody else to be responsive to them. And so, what am I wanting you to look at today? Are you a resource or a roadblock? Are you a resource or a roadblock? Listen, if you had something to do with these partners meeting, if you had something to do with establishing the relationship, you introduced them to one another, you may be struggling with guilt that you ever connected them. Okay. If you allow that guilt to override your decency, you'll reject the notion that the person that you introduced to this friend or this family member is, in fact, an abusive person. And if you do that, then what you're really saying is The most important thing in this whole entire equation is that I not be wrong about having introduced them or having connected them. It's that I not acknowledge that that was not a good decision, that was not a good matchup. Um, and I can exclude myself then and excuse myself from any responsibility for having introduced these people to one another. Okay. So, once again, if we're going to be a resource, then the victim has to be the most important person in the scenario. It can't be us. It can't be us wanting to protect our ego or our pride or our track record at matchmaking or our judgment or our prophetic ability or whatever. We need to be able to accept this certainly was not my intention that someone be abused. I feel horrible about this. I feel horrible about it. And I'm not going to wallow in that though, because the most important thing is the safety of the person that's being mistreated. The other thing that you may experience if you're teetering on the edge of being a roadblock is you may really be tempted to find a reasonable excuse for the abusive behavior. They were dropped on their head at birth. Their father was in prison. Their mother was a streetwalker. Um, they were raised by elderly grandparents who could not be involved with their schoolwork, et cetera, et cetera. They have a substance abuse issue. These are all excuses that make it okay for one human being to abuse another human being. No matter what the circumstances are, it's wrong, and it's wrong no matter who's doing it. But if we're still in self protective mode, we'll try to find a reason that's acceptable. And ultimately, we end up blaming the victim. When we are engaging in a self protective stance, it requires that we re victimize the victim who's already been traumatized. So, what am I challenging you to do? I'm challenging you to be intentional about identifying your gut level reaction to being told that an acquaintance, a loved one, a friend has been the perpetrator of domestic violence. This will assist you in being able to honestly assess if you are a resource or a roadblock to a domestic violence victim. All right. Once you do this, if your assessment reveals that you have inadvertently been a roadblock, you can take steps to become a resource, okay? You can take steps to become a resource. Educate yourself. Identify resources in your community or in the victim's community. Remind the victim that they have value and that no one deserves to be mistreated or abused. Educate yourself some more. Support entities that are committed to ending domestic violence. Listen, if you take an honest assessment of your reaction, right, when you've been told that someone's been the victim of abuse of any kind, I want you to remember this. All behavior is goal oriented. All behavior, everything that we do is goal oriented. We are either trying to accomplish a thing or prevent a thing from being accomplished, okay? And ask yourself, why do I need to believe that this is not true? Why do I need to believe that this is not taking place? And why is that more important than the safety of the victim? And what does this say about me as a person? If we are able to deny the existence of any injustice, any wrongdoing, any maltreatment, we are automatically excused from any expectation of addressing it. And we can simply act as though it's not real. We've been talking about, am I a resource or a roadblock? And I'm challenging you to take a close introspective look at your reaction when you're told that someone's being mistreated. And this will go a long ways in letting you know what category you fit into. If you don't like what you see, what you learn, after you take a close look at yourself and your reaction to hearing about abuse in any form, note that there are steps that you can take to turn that around. And it starts with educating yourself. Educate yourself about it, okay? So that you can be a resource. This is Apostle Cheryl, the Judas Road Domestic Violence Awareness Initiative. It is our prayer that this video has been helpful to you in identifying where you stand on the issue of domestic violence. If you are a resource or a roadblock, really want you to engage in some introspection and determine for yourself if you've been a resource or a roadblock. And if you determine that you've been a roadblock, take the steps that we've outlined to change that. You stay safe out there. Blessings to you.